Okay, so we're gonna have some fun. I mean, I gotta say, everyone's polite. You know, it's quiet. It's all good. We're gonna have some fun for real. Let me give you a quick synopsis. Had the keynote this morning. Super excited about it. I remember when they reached out. They're like, "Dude, we got a slot. Do you want to do this keynote?" I was like, "Okay." They had seen me do the keynote prior, like a month and a half, whatnot. And I was like, "Man, I'm totally down to do it." You know, I kind of remixed it, threw in my little Oslo thing going on. I was kind of proud of that, actually. And I had this other talk ready. I was like, "Dude, I'm so excited. Resource loading, let's go." Did the talk this morning. Everything was gravy. Had a bit of an issue with my laptop. So I actually had to sort of like rebuild my talk from like memory. All right, I just wanted to post some memoirs that right there. So we're going to make this super fun and interactive. And I know you're laughing already. But we're going to have some fun for real, because this is the kind of stuff I actually like to talk about. So for those who weren't at my talk this morning, let me introduce myself once again, because you're probably sick of it. My name's Henri. Last name's not Helvetica. It's just a nom de plume that I loved, and I started to use at conferences, and people always seem to ask me if it's real or not. It's a real nom de plume, but it's not my real last name. My name is Henri, so if you do speak French, I'll definitely answer that. I'll also answer to Henri, so that's no problem there. That is my Twitter handle. If you want to have a conversation about stuff I'm going to talk about, or anything else really, or the talk this morning. And I'm a freelancer. I'm from the great city of Toronto. I threw this up because I do run the Toronto Web Performance Group. So if you're ever in the building, you're ever in Toronto passing through, come on down. I'd love to have you. Hell, you could actually register for the meetup group, and because I tend to send out resources and links from time to time. I do help out with a couple of the meetups as well, but I'm not going to talk about those. So we're going to dig right into it and get into the semblance of the talk I wanted to give. So resource loading, it's kind of changed along the years. Definitely. And it's gotten a lot more complicated. And so much, I wouldn't say so much complicated, but there are a lot of things that have changed, APIs that have come around that are there to kind of like help us out. Resources, file formats that are changing as well, all to address a particular need. And that need, more specifically, we're going to talk about this, but it really comes down to mobile. I mean, a lot of these additions that are being made are there specifically to address the need that's happening at the mobile level, the friction that's happening at the mobile level, and also to address some of this sort of, how could I put it, challenging conditions that people using mobile go through. So with that being said, obviously some of you have seen the movie that this is from. I was talking about this earlier today. I was kind of proud of this graphic. But that being said, like I said, I sort of built this deck a while back. So 30 years, the web has been around, and you heard that from me earlier today. And in the 30 years, a lot has changed. That's without a doubt. I mean, things were built over at CERN, and back then it was, the web was pretty much textual. It was pretty much text, blue text, click, information comes up, resource gets downloaded, and we went from there. And obviously, things really got cracking over at the Illinois campus, because that's where Mosaic was built. And obviously, apologies, I don't want to say obviously, but some of you may remember what this was like. I never really had a chance to play with it that much, but it definitely was around. And Mark Andreessen was responsible for that, him and his team of a few. It was a part-time project, would you believe? He was working part-time building this. And he had been introduced to browsers by a woman who worked at that office, who also worked in, I believe, in graphic design. computer graphic design anyways. So Mark Andreessen put out Mosaic over at the Illinois campus, and as we talked about earlier today, and again, this is sort of like there was overlap between the two talks, so if you saw this earlier, I have to apologize. But there was a big rush to get online, and they saw 65 million users kind of adopt this browser, this software, to experience what the web was all about. Now, as things grew, there's some elements of the web that people, again, did not expect to happen. And I'm very adamant about this because I feel like this is the sort of inflection point where things really started to take off. And I bring back to the fact that mobile was not something that we expected to explode like it has right now. Now, obviously, we're looking at the iPhones here, sort of on the high end of the mobile spectrum. But regardless, whether it be iPhones, Androids, or feature phones, they basically have penetrated the market all over the world. And as you heard from me earlier today, over half the planet is on the web, and it's being done mostly, if not entirely in some markets, through mobile. Now, why do I insist on talking about mobile? Well, I do because November 2016 was a significant moment in sort of, I consider, web history. Mobile and tablet usage overtakes desktop for the first time. Now keep that in mind. It finally just went 50% and ticked up. What does that mean? Well, it means that plain, more people are on mobile than on desktop. But what you also have to remember is it's not going back. We're not going to go back into time and say, hey, you know what, this desktop thing is going to work out a bit better. I'm going back. No, it's over. So what you're seeing right now is a very steady, continuous growth towards, I won't say the complete eroding of the desktop unit. They're still going to be around. That's without a doubt. But you have to consider mobile almost exclusively. Now, earlier today, you heard me talk about, to an extent, where the growth is at, where the population that is on mobile, where they're coming from. There's some stats out there if you want to take a look. I'll be more than happy to send links that will show you that, sort of like, I like to call it the G7 countries. So United States, UK, et cetera, their growth has kind of flattened out. They're at like 95% penetration. So what they're experiencing right now, that's it. But when you start to look at areas like Africa, they're at 64% mobile right now and steadily rising. Asia, which has been on mobile for a minute, at 65%, steadily rising. India, a territory that has been sort of parsed heavily by certain companies, 78% on mobile and steadily rising. And one thing that you have to realize, and I'm sort of beating this point, that they're on sort of a medium to low end market on the phones. And I threw this slide up because you have to understand that we might buy a phone like, I don't know, I have an iPhone 7, I'm not the cool person, but my iPhone 6 in the closet, whatever, I'm not really going to use it. These markets, hand to hand. New phone goes down to someone else. So a lot of these phones stay on the network. They stay on the grid. It's not like, oh, finally I can get rid, we're not going to see iOS 6 on the network anymore. Yes, you will see them. And that happens in Android heavily. So there's a hand-to-hand kind of like distribution of these devices. So you end up having some of these devices remain on the network. devices like this one right here, and this is like, a new one, but this is a Samsung A series. Again, these come in at very low pricing, and they end up staying on the network quite often, quite long. So, and, even though I did talk about areas like Africa, areas like India, I could have gone and talked about areas like Mexico. Instagram was doing some research out there, trying to understand how the people operate. So the low-end market, as much as we know and feel like, okay, I know these territories, but I'm going to bring you to number 2 right here, which is the USA. Number 1, India, yes. Number 3, Russia, okay, cool. Number 2 is the United States. You do have a faction of people who do not buy iPhone, whatever. They don't buy the S10s or whatever they do at Samsung. Again, I talked about this earlier today, where there was this program called the Obama phones, which I had never heard of until about a month ago, where people with moderate income, if not on the poor side, were enrolled in programs where they can get cheap phones to participate in the digital economy, because without that, they wouldn't be able to. A good friend of mine who's an engineer who worked at Google, just recently left and went to a different job, said that's how he got on the net. That's how he grew up. These devices. So it's important to remember that these devices are on the network from the international sort of like developing markets right down to some markets like America. So what does that mean? There's a lot of friction being experienced online. People with these devices aren't experiencing the web like we might, because we have decent phones, we have decent connectivity. They don't. Let's talk about this connectivity. This is what it's like across the globe. And people don't realize, yes, we do have 4G, significant amounts. Yes, there's a lot of 3G. By the way, 4G and 3G are pretty much the same. 4G is kind of like a really good 3G level. 2G, obviously, very poor, but it is out there on the market. It is being experienced by people today. I'm going to sidetrack for a hot second. So I'm from Toronto, where we finally got unlimited, plans. Believe it or not, I think, Canada was like a holdout. But guess what? If you had 5 or 6 gigs per month, the unlimited is really the balance over the 6 gig comes in at 256. That's the fine print. These are things you want to remember. I'm going to post some slides with, the real slides anyways, with some of these links and things I'd love for you guys to listen to. This is an episode of this show called In Real Life. It's actually by Mozilla. And they talk about the challenges of working with just crappy connectivity, not being in territories where there is decent connectivity sometimes, if any, and kids trying to go to school, learn with this kind of situation. So when we talk about connectivity, when we talk about performance, when we talk about making sure that we have a good user experience, there's a statistic that's been floating around for a couple of years now that we like to talk about all the time. And it's basically being on mobile at 3G and the kind of bounce rate that people experience, or you'll experience, like this one right here. 53% of visitors will abandon a page that takes 3 seconds or more to load. Okay, that's like a standard stat right now. Anyone who likes to talk about performance will hear this being discussed. Expanding on that, because there was some research done by a Google company. It's page, it'll come back to me. 77% of pages load in 10 seconds or more, with the average page loading in 19 seconds. Now, this is on mobile, this is on 3G. And you might think to yourself, okay, 19 seconds, I've experienced that before. It's not that bad, Henri. Like, I've done, like, whatever. I've seen worse. Well, let's experience 19 seconds together. All right. Just keep your eye on the clock at the top right. We're going to go through 19 seconds of bad user experience. And it's still going. It's still going. It's still going. It's still going. Yeah. That's exactly what happened. Some of you might remember this was as they described it, a stunning 19-second handshake. And I remember reading the stat. I remember seeing this thing, and I was like, I'm going to connect the dots. That was 19 seconds. Now imagine going to helihansing.com and nothing happening for 19 seconds. You would have left at like 9 seconds. Keep that in mind. So, with that being said, I'm going to throw you this quote right here. This quote that I like. Resource loading is a delicate dance that can be delightful, but also destructive due to device damper and limitations. Device damper and limitations. This is what some of these people are experiencing. There are days that I experienced that on an iPhone 7. And I really like this quote because it's actually mine. I wrote that myself, thank you. So let's, we're going to look at a bit of resource loading and what I was able to jot down. And I'm going to talk about some more as well. It's really about like what's being done in the last several years, and especially the last 3 or 4, to address the challenges that we're experiencing, from the network level to the resources that are being that are coming down the pipe as much as possible. And there's some stuff that's probably not going to be a deck that I'm just going to freestyle and talk about myself. So let's look at resource loading. Now, I'm going to start with things surrounding the network. Who here has heard of resource hints? Okay, that's totally cool because I'm going to hit you with the links. You know, resource hints. We have pre-connect, we have pre-fetch, we have pre-render. I'm also going to, pardon me, I'm also going to give you links to our articles, case studies from companies that we know that have employed some of these tactics, some of these technologies to speed up their experiences, to create better experiences for their users. So let's look at what these resource hints are all about. So, I mean, a modern browser has to leverage a variety of optimization techniques. And this is really to anticipate user input and intent. So this is what we're starting to do now. We're trying to sort of predict where you're going to go next in your browsing journey. So obviously it's going to take a little bit of research. You're going to sit down with the team and you're going to be like, okay, we believe that this person's probably going to go on this link afterwards. So let's start to create these conditions where resources are coming down the wire so that we can make this a better environment for the sort of like resources to come down the pipe. It's really, and the resource hints are about reducing latency, because when it comes to the network, latency is the biggest challenge. There was, and I'm going to send a link about, I'm going to provide the link there. An engineer a while back by the name of Mike Belshi, who worked at Google, wrote this piece comparing bandwidth and latency and letting you know that you can have all the bandwidth in the world, it's still about latency. So by anticipating the user input and intent, we'll be able to deal with some of the network processing and challenges specifically around latency. So pre-connects, pre-fetching of resources and pre-rendering of resources for subsequent navigations. So we're going to look at pre-connect. It is essentially what it sounds like, pre-connecting. So you'll be able to essentially maintain the DNS, the TCP, the handshake, in order to, again, reduce the latency. The TLS negotiation. These are little moments in a resource load that add up, and it comes down to latency and time. Who here digs into DevTools sometimes and you hover over a resource and you can see what kind of the time that takes for a resource to load up? Anyone here? Awesome. Do it all the time. DevTools will expose the truth. No fake news around DevTools. Pre-connect will do that. Prefetching, it is what it is. You'll be able to prefetch some resources, again, in order, as you're predicting where the user is going to go, you're going to get these resources ready to come down the wire. It's a little like preloading, not exactly. I'm going to talk about that a little later. But again, the idea that we're now in the space where we're prefetching resources is kind of like, I'm going to go get this coffee. Oh, the coffee's ready. That's like prefetching. When you go to Starbucks, you could just do that order and stuff. That's actually a really good comparison because you're essentially dealing with latency by pre-ordering the coffee. You get there, it's already ready. You don't have to deal with the baristas like, oh, what do you want to get? No. I already ordered. And it's right there. Pre-rendering, where you're getting, it's a bit more complicated, but essentially you're going to even go further and pre-render an entire page and have the page ready for the user to experience and to come down the wire. So these are resource hints where you're able to make some predictions and have some actions take place at varying levels so that, again, we're having a reduction in latency and we're having an improvement in user experience. Because the latency was creating a little bit of bottleneck and friction. Did I hear something? Okay, cool. Since we're talking about the network, we're going to talk about HTTP2 real quick. A show of hands if you're familiar with H2. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Obviously, it is an upgrade from H1. H1.1, in fact, had been around for quite a while. And it was kind of serving its purpose, but it was also full of challenges. They had limitations, again, around the network, the amount of concurrent downloads you could make. Eventually, H2 came around. And the big deal about H2 was the fact that we were going to be able to multiplex. And what I mean about multiplex is you're going to have concurrent downloads. So instead of having like 1 download, 2 downloads, 3 downloads, 4, one after the other, it was like 6 downloads all at once, and more, really. But H2 was definitely a very important moment when that went to, that went live, when the support was available with all the browsers. And you had things like header compression, which again, the amount of bytes you were able to save by doing that. Now, I'm not going to spend an enormous time here, but there were some challenges around H2 that were discovered just recently in some studies, because we found that H2 was like, yeah, we're getting some improvements, but it's not what we're really looking for. I feel like some more stuff should be happening. Well, they're correct. So one of the challenges with H2 is that you basically have to make sure that your server is also tuned to accept and work with H2 as best as possible, and that was not being done. That research was being done, was completed by Pat Meenan and Andy Davies out of the UK. Pat Meenan, who's actually Oh my, is he still at Facebook? I think he might be, yeah. But anyhow, really good research. And again, this was, they discovered that by not tuning the servers right, they weren't getting the best possible performance from HTTP2. And they wrote a long blog post about that, and I'll be able to share the links there as well. I'm going to step away from the network, and I'm going to talk about another massive problem online, and especially on mobile phones: image management. I mean, this is a kind of area that I love to talk about because people do not realize the challenges, that is in dealing with images. I mean, I was talking about this today, we were laughing, but image management is like walking on a floor full of Legos. It's just not fun. And it's kind of painful because once you see the real challenges that are taking place, you're actually not going to be happy. Again, if you pop open DevTools, like, I'll be honest, I've, you know those ultra-wide monitors now, the cool people have them? I mean, I just heard, so I just bought one because I'm not cool, rest assured. But it's fantastic for DevTools because I look at every site and you will be shocked to see what happens. Like I said, image management's like stepping on Legos. Let's look at some quick stats. Normally, you should not be sending images or image weight between desktop and mobile. There should be a great delta, but unfortunately there isn't. Which means there's mismanagement, which means that you're forcing your phone to do some of the same work expected from a desktop, and it's not going to happen. Images come with toxicity. They actually are responsible for, especially on the Android side, a lot of OS crashing because they're sized improperly, they're eating up a lot of memory, and OSs are like, and your app's done. This was some information that came from Ilya Grigorik at Google during a presentation. He talked about that. So what should we be doing with images? Well, ideally, you'd be serving them on a CDN. Yes, we all know what a CDN is. Hand up, I'm imagining. Content Delivery Network, all good. They're perfect for CDNs. But the problem is, we found out that only 48% of images and cacheable resources are being served by CDNs. So basically, there's major opportunity here to get some better image deliveries. So in the meantime, what are we doing? Well, we're using things like the picture tag that came out a while back. It was meant to help us out with like different formats and obviously different sized images. But again, this is a challenge that developers are having a problem with. And for those who aren't familiar with the picture tag, it's a responsive images method to control which image resource a user agent presents to a user based on resolution, media query, and or support for a particular image format. Just the fact that we know that a lot of images are being sized improperly at mobile means that either they're not using a picture tag or they're using it improperly. These are some of the challenges that we're experiencing on the web and especially at mobile. I'm going to talk about lazy loading. This is significant, yes, because for a while we were using it with some libraries, but more recently, Chrome, I believe it's Chrome stable now. And if you even do a search on Twitter, you'll see that a lot of people who are using it are experiencing fantastic levels of sort of like performance upgrades. Lazy loading is important. Some stats like, I believe, something like 50% of people were going to the bottom of the page. So 1 out of 2 people were not hitting the bottom, but somehow you're serving the assets at the same time. So you're basically wasting data on both ends, as for a user and as a business, and potentially ruining the user experience as well. Now, I was looking at some stats on HTTP Archive, and you should go check that out as well, httparchive.org. They basically say it's how the web was built, but it's really fascinating data. And they talk about the bytes that were potentially being saved if we had enabled lazy loading on a library level and or at the browser level, which is available right now. So you'll see at the median, okay, not too much. Okay, we get it, like just under 50, it's about 350 kilobytes, or bytes, pardon me. But at P75, P90, a lot of data is being burnt right there. All you have to do is flick the switch now. And you can still have a fallback like the libraries that are available. And we can even get into things like intersection observer. That, when that came out, even though it wasn't built specifically for images, it was being used for images. Again, I'm going to provide a link to that, the intersection observer API. Really, really good. And another thing that fell under kind of images, but also CSS, also JavaScript, code coverage. Now, code coverage is a method by which you can take a look at the amount of resources that were just not being used. Again, specifically more on the CSS side and the JavaScript side. Again, very important because both of those assets are render blocking. And what has happened since is that we've figured out a way to, like, okay, back in the day, we would just send the CSS down the pipe, the JS down the pipe, we'd figure it out, everything was cool, whatever happened, happened. No, we can't look at it that way anymore because we need to make sure that we send down only the assets that are required at the time. So that's why on the JavaScript side, and I really want to deep dive on this, but I'll provide the links. The tree shaking. That's why Webpack became relatively important in this whole solution. Hope I'm not bothering you by pacing back and forth. It's just something I do. But code coverage is very important. Now, you can actually take a look at that if you, again, open up DevTools, and there's a panel, and you could just do a recording, bump around, play around with your site, and you'll be able to see how much unused scripts are on your page. And at that point, you'll be able to make an informed decision as to what you need to do, again, to make sure that you send down the bytes that are necessary for this application to work. Because again, depending on the framework that you use and whatnot, you may have a lot that are that's just sitting around doing absolutely nothing. What else did I want to talk about here? I feel like there's an extra thing here that's missing. Oh, okay. So now I'm going to talk about something that, so Google, this was actually kind of funny. So Google has obviously spent some time, especially the people on the Chrome team, everyone involved with Chrome, so from the, well, just so many teams, Speed team, Blink team, etc. They would have this thing called the Intervention Quarterly. It was actually public for a while. It was really funny because they wrote it like a newspaper, but they talked about what they were doing to improve the user experience, improve the speed of loading assets. And, you know, these were ideas that they were playing with, potentially far out, but eventually some of them would come to fruition. So I could point you to a video where Pat Meenan, when he was still at Chrome, talked about the idea of lazy loading natively at the browser level. And this was like 2016. And this went stable this year. So 3 years ago, they were talking about that. They're also talking about things like, again, they're having trouble kind of implementing these things, but, you know, because there's a developer experience challenge, but they realize that, like I said, the asset delivery, especially on the image side, people are not sending the right sized images. So there was a talk of inverting the image so that you could see there was an issue there. These are some of the interventions that they had. They have interventions where if they sense that the network is reaching this sort of like low 3G, 2G level, they're talking about limiting the amount of JavaScript that comes down the pipe, or even potentially limiting the amount of resources being loaded. This was behind a flag on Chrome. It got yanked because, again, they were having debates about the developer experience, the UI. They weren't very confident in what was going on. But this is the kind of conversation that's taking place on a daily basis. This is why, and again, I'm not saying that everyone or anyone here is guilty, but this is why it's a conversation that you want to keep in mind on how to be as thrift as possible with your resources, with your assets. Send down only what's necessary. Now, in some cases, you may have to have this conversation with marketing because they want to make sure that the new Nike, I don't know what, looks good on the page. That's no problem. But as a developer, you want to also let them know that there is a bit of a responsibility to make sure that we don't send too much down the pipe. I don't know if everyone here is on Twitter, but more recently, Apple was getting smashed because they launched the new iPod Pros. Is it iPod Pros or iPods Pro? That was like another debate. But the page came in at like 60 megs or something like that. And I was like, old news. Because Steve Jobs was very like, crisp images at any cost. Rest assured, people with like limited bandwidth were not looking at that. People with crappy phones probably couldn't download that. Images were too big, Retina, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, this was very informal, and I definitely want to do a Q&A and have a conversation about this. But, I mean, again, I'm going to deliver a deck with some very significant links that you'll be able to check out, read, and see what people are doing. But the idea is that there are a lot of APIs out there. There are a lot of updates that are being done that we can use today in order to make sure that we are as thrift as possible with the resources when we send them down the pipe. A lot of APIs. I'll give you a quick example. You may not know, but we talked about formats, video formats. You know, we mostly talk about images all the time, you know, blah, 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 blah. There's WebP, et cetera, et cetera. But on the video level, YouTube has been sending down AV1s. AV1 is a format, a video format, that is basically going to be, to an extent, the future of video people must know. Oh, you don't know? Oh, okay. Well, we're going to have a talk after, too. But they've been sending AV1s down the pipe right now. I'll send you a link to the talk about that. And this is something that is likely going to be the future, simply because the browsers have all agreed that this is where we need to go. a lot better compression, crisper quality. They're still tweaking it, but it's basically happening as we speak. I mean, I can get into some other stuff that's gonna, get into the experimental side of town. I'll be more than happy to talk about it during the party tonight because I'll nerd out. But the takeaway is, let's use some of the technologies that are available to us right now. Even the most simplest ones can help provide a better experience for the users on the end, and also just in general, because you don't want to send 20 megs down the line. Like it's incredible. And again, keep DevTools open. I'm not lying to you. You're going to see some of these sites. You're going to be like, wow, what is going on here? You don't realize the kind of stuff that people are sending down the pipe. There's a conference taking place right now in Oakland. And I remember I wanted to just see what the schedule was like and who was speaking. And DevTools was open. 90 megs of resources came down the pipe. I would never have known this. People are on their phone looking at this right now. It's incredible. And that's just the beginning. So that being said, this is far from a sermon. I just want to have a conversation. Thank you for listening, but I absolutely would love to take some questions. Anyone have some? Yes, sir. So the question is the following. Is the responsibility on the developer or the browser? Well, I could answer that in a bunch of different ways. I do not believe the browsers or the people, the engineers on the browsers, should be spending their days creating interventions. So an intervention is like a seatbelt. An intervention would be like a breathalyzer check. They don't want to do it, but unfortunately they have to. Image management is tough. Working with a ton of JavaScript can be tough. Getting your CSS wrong can be tough. And they're out there trying to help you out because they're like, I know what you're trying to do there. We're going to help you and just get that done. So ultimately, it is going to be a collaborative situation, but it is best when the developer has a bit of that acumen, knows what to do, how to interpret a situation and pinpoint the challenge and say, oh, this is what's going on. Again, I get back to the idea of like looking at DevTools. DevTools will tell you exactly what's taking place. Do not let a pretty a page that loads beautifully, all the images came in awesome. You're like, done. It's Friday. Let's go. And DevTools is like, look at these assets. This is not loading right. Look at this. You forgot to, in your sort of like experimentation, you left like 2 frameworks on the network, and they're going down the pipe for no reason. This is a bit of a developer responsibility there. Good question, though. Do I have another one? Yes, sir. Yes. So, man, maybe I could show it right now. I'll be going to someone else's site, but give me a second. Ultimately, like right now, it's going to be like the flick of a switch. The way they added it. So I'll show you in a second. So basically what I'm saying is, once upon a time, it was a library. And we understood that, that's fine. But now that Chrome added it, and I'm talking about Chrome for a couple of reasons, because they tend to be the people working on speed initiatives when it comes to the web. This is not, I'm not slamming Firefox, I'm not slamming Safari or anyone else, but Chrome tends to be the ones pushing the speed ideas forward. So we're going to look at some Chrome stuff as I open up Safari. So I'm going to go to web.dev, where they're probably going to have the answer. And hold up. And if you're not familiar with web.dev, it's a while back. I don't know if you remember when the .dev domain came up, and Chrome was like, that's ours. And basically the idea is that they're setting up these sites where you can go and get all the information when it comes to when it comes to developer info. So I just went to web.dev, and I'm super proud to talk about this because a buddy of mine wrote this piece. Sorry, guys. Our team, folks. Come on. Where did I just lose it? Oh, come on. Okay, hold on. Bingo. Oh, there we go. Bam. Okay. So you'll be able to see this article, but essentially, this is my buddy here, Canadian. They'll be able to show you right down here how to implement it, and I think, where is it? Because I remember I saw it on, that's behind this. So this might be a late one. Boom, right here. Can you see that? Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm saying the flick of a switch right now. It was a little different prior to that. Again, whether or not you were using a library, or like, hello? You guys kicking me off stage? Or you're using intersection observer. Again, there's some examples out there where people are using that to lazy load images. It got a little bit more detailed because depending on where in the viewport you want to load the asset, you could sort of tweak that, but that's available right now. Now, it might be behind a flag, I'll have to double check, but if you go to web.dev, just search lazy loading, it'll come up. I must have some more questions.
I guess we run out of time.